I get asked a lot about the difference between gouache and aqua gouache and watercolor. Um, and, I thought I'd throw an acrylic in there. So we're going to look at the difference between these four and how you might go about using them in layers. This is just kind of a little mini segment on that. I'm going to do a larger class on more layering and how to use these four types of paints together and how not to. Okay, in a nutshell, I think of watercolor and gouache above the line here, and acrylic gouache and acrylic paint below the line. And the line represents whether or not you can reconstitute it with water, which to me is the most important difference in these. So the ones above, I can add water even after they've dried and move the paint around and change it. Below, you can't, because the acrylic gouache has acrylic binder in it and the acrylic paint has acrylic binder in it. They use a different binder for these, gum arabic or another binder, but it's water soluble. So that's the main difference. There are other differences, of course, and it's what I try to do here is paint similar color, like a rose color, so that you could even see the differences. You can see how the watercolor is less intense and bleeds into the paper a little bit more. You get some bleeding with the gouache, a much more intense color. Now, of course, I'm sure you can find a watercolor, and you can use more watercolor to get more intensity, more of the paint. But this feels, if you could feel the difference, there's a chalkiness over here to the gouache. And so it's flatter and more chalky and opaque. And then the acryl gouache is very similar to the acrylic, except that it doesn't have any sort of sheen. I don't know if you can see that, but acrylic has a very subtle, sometimes subtle, but some brands pretty shiny, plasticky feel. That's because there's a lot of plastic in acrylic paint. This has still that chalky finish, but not quite as chalky as the gouache. So let's see what happens, just so I can demonstrate, when you try to add water to these. So here's the watercolor, and it'll take me a bit to wet it, but I can pull the paint out and go in and change it. You'll see that where I had it, there is a line under there. You can't completely move it, but you can move it quite a bit. And you can come back in and add another color. You can even say you had an area you wanted to remove paint. You can wet it and dab it with a paper towel and almost erase. It's hard to erase it completely, but you can remove paint and manipulate it that way with water. Gouache is going to behave very similarly. The color is more intense, but I can still re-wet it. I can spread it around, draw it out, remove it. And if I try that down here, I'm getting nowhere. Nowhere at all. If I really, really rub, I might be able to physically rub some paint off, and that's what I did there. Basically, I start rubbing. If I really scrub it, see, I can get some paint off. Also, this hasn't dried that long, so that might be harder. And then the acrylic, even more so, is going to be hard. Very hard to remove. It's pretty much, paper towel came up clean. So I do find that the acryl gouache, it really is, it's like they took these two and mixed them, the gouache and acrylic, which they did. So it isn't as permanent as acrylic, but it's still pretty darn permanent. I can paint over it, especially if it's completely dry. Well, it has to be completely dry. And I can do layers over it, and I'm not going to get colors mixing in like I would with the others. So let's look at that idea of layering. If I wanted to take something that was, a bottom layer of one of these, and then layer over it with, let's use an acryl gouache to layer over. Because if I use watercolor gouache here, which I've done before, I've done a lot of gouache on gouache paintings, but you end up, you can put it on there carefully and let it be, but if you disturb the layer too much, you're going to bring the color in that was below it. And that may be an effect that you want. But if we take this gouache and layer over, I'll show you what I mean. Let's say I was doing a leaf on top of a background that was this gouache. So I was able to do it. It didn't blend too much, but if I kept fussing or if I started adding water, I'll do it over here, and I use my, a little bit of water and started, so you can see that the yellow is mixing with the pink underneath. And we've got kind of an orange color, which again, just depends on the effect that you want. If you play with it, if you keep, manipulating it, you're going to disturb the gouache underneath. Watercolor, you can also layer on top of using the Acryl gouache again. And similarly to this one, the less I fuss with it and the less water I use, the more it's going to stay. Now on this one, I don't have to worry about the fussing, and the color will sit on there much more vibrantly because it's not blending with below. So you can probably see the difference in the intensity on this leaf versus that, and I'm using the same paint, and even that. Same thing with the acrylic. I'm going to be able to put a bright yellow leaf on here. Now when I used to do a lot of gouache over gouache paintings, I could go over, if I wanted that intensity, once that lower layer dried, if I said, oh, I really wanted it to be bright, then I could layer over it and get that bright, do another, basically a second coat. So you can achieve the same thing, it's just that here you don't have to worry about it. I'm finding that I'm using more and more Acryl gouache. It really seems to be the best of all worlds for me. I do use acrylic. I don't love the plasticky feel to it, but I definitely use it, especially on bottom layers. It depends on the color, but I find myself leaning more toward the Acryl gouache. What I thought I'd do here is do a quick sketch using one type of each of the 4 paints. So I'm starting here with watercolor, because a watercolor, if you're doing a layered piece like this, should be at the bottom. You can also do a watercolor wash over other things. I really don't like having rules when it comes to art and creating, because you never know what you might discover. And then I'm coming in with the teal acrylic paint. It's a Liquitex acrylic paint. The orange is a Daniel Smith watercolor. And I'm just playing and seeing what how they interact. And you can see that the teal acrylic is already blending with the watercolor. And now I'm adding Acryl gouache. That's the navy. It's a Holbein Acryl gouache. I love those Holbein Acryl gouaches. And of course, that's interacting with the both of the watercolor and the acrylic a little bit. Now I'm coming in with some traditional gouache and moving that around. And you see, I don't know if you can tell looking at it, but the acrylic just kind of sits on there. It's translucent, but it doesn't have any good color intensity because it's soaking into the paper, and it seems to kind of lose some of its pigment. If you were using it on gesso, I think it would be more vibrant, but it doesn't have the vibrancy of the other colors. Now that dried, so I'm coming in with some second bits, same paints though, because I'm, for this exercise sticking with the same paints. And I found this was interesting. I'm trying to get that acrylic to just flow, the way gouache does, and you can see I'm struggling. I'm having to re-wet the brush, put more paint on it, and then the line is coming out kind of, that's okay. But it's just not easy to work with. It's not flowing the way that I know any of the other 3 paints would flow. See how I just have to keep wetting and working hard to get it to do what I want it to do. Now I'm coming back in with the regular gouache and just layering on top of the already dried. And I could have put these little pink dots anywhere because it's dry, and as long as I didn't disturb the paper too much, if I was putting it on top of the watercolor, it would be fine. So I encourage you to do this kind of thing, you know, experiment with the different layers, colors. I splattered some of the aqua gouache there, and I'm just kind of having fun with layering the different types of paint. And you can also mix watercolor and gouache with gesso. Well, of course, you probably know you can mix acrylic with it, but with gesso, and get some opacity in the colors, white gesso or even black gesso. And that's kind of fun to do as well. But this was a fun, I'll probably come back, you know, the living sketchbook thing, I'll probably come back into this with some pen, maybe some metallic gold, and do some things. Now here I'm taking the watercolor back over, and because it's a really nice, good quality watercolor, I was able to get some beautiful intensity. Keep playing!